happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where nothing feels unusual until everything changes at once. I had stepped out of the conference room with a stack of reports in my hands, focused on the numbers I had been reviewing, when I noticed my boss standing near the end of the hallway. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on me in a way that instantly froze the air around us. I thought he would ask for an update or give me a new assignment. Instead, he waited until I walked closer and then motioned toward a narrow corner beside the supply closet, as if he wanted privacy. My instincts told me something was wrong, but I followed anyway, unaware that the next few minutes would alter the course of everything I believed about professionalism and safety. The hallway lights flickered above us, with that cold fluorescent glow that always made the building feel more like a basement than an office. As soon as I stepped into the corner, he reached behind me and nudged the door of the supply closet until it was half closed, cutting off most of the surrounding noise. My heart thumped hard in my chest. This was not a casual conversation. His face was too rigid, his tone too low, his gaze too sharp. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the cologne he wore every year during performance reviews, the same cologne he used when he wanted to project authority. Something inside me tightened. I realized he was not here to discuss work. He wanted control. His voice dropped to a chilling calm as he confronted me about the questions I had been asking regarding missing overtime hours. I had thought I was following protocol by requesting clarification. I had documented everything. I had even approached HR about the discrepancies, assuming the company would handle it. But he clearly had a different view. His words were slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that settled deep in my stomach. In that moment, I felt the kind of fear adults rarely admit to feeling. The fear that comes when you realize someone with power is looking at you not as a worker or a colleague, but as a threat to be silenced. As he spoke, my mind raced through possibilities. I wondered if he planned to write me up. I wondered if this was the beginning of some hidden retaliation. I wondered if he would pull my projects away or try to push me out. I had heard stories from older coworkers about how quickly a career could crumble under the pressure of a determined supervisor, but I never thought I would stand in the crosshairs myself. I felt the walls closing in, and for a brief moment I almost said nothing. I almost let the fear swallow me whole. But something stronger pushed me to act. My hand slipped into my pocket without conscious thought. It felt like my body moved before my mind did, driven by a mixture of instinct and dread. I brushed my fingers against my phone, unlocked it with practiced ease, and tapped the record button. The device vibrated lightly, a silent acknowledgement that it was now capturing every breath, every threat, every detail. I kept my arm pressed against my side, so he would not notice. I forced my expression to remain neutral, as if I was simply listening, even though my pulse hammered so loudly I felt it in my throat. He stepped closer, invading my space until I could feel the heat of his breath on my cheek. I kept my eyes steady, refusing to show fear even as tension wrapped itself around me like a tightening rope. The building seemed to fall silent. I no longer heard printers humming or phones ringing. All I heard was his voice, sharp and controlled, cutting into me with the precision of someone who believed he had absolute authority. My breathing grew shaky. I fought to keep it quiet, so the recording would remain clear. I knew that if my fear spilled into the audio, it would reveal how vulnerable he made me feel, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Time slowed. Every second stretched into a long thread of pressure and unease. There was no one else in the hallway.
No witnesses.
No escape route. He positioned himself as if he wanted to block any attempt I might make to leave. I realized that he had chosen this exact spot for a reason. This corner was known for its lack of camera coverage. He had used it before to give harsh warnings to other employees, warnings that never left the shadow of this hallway. Now it was my turn. The realization sent a cold shiver through me, but I stayed still and let the moment record itself. His expression changed as he continued speaking. His eyes narrowed, his lips pulled tight, and his tone hardened.
He did not yell. He did not need to.
His quiet hostility carried far more weight than raised voices ever could. He told me I had been asking too many questions about payroll discrepancies. He said I had been digging into things that were not my concern. He reminded me that people who caused trouble rarely lasted long in corporate environments. His statements were not framed as guidance or advice. They were threats, clear and unmistakable, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed consequences would never reach him. My fear slowly gave way to something else. Anger. Not loud anger, but the grounded kind that comes when a person realizes they are being attacked simply for doing their job honestly. I felt my jaw tighten. I felt my shoulders stiffen. I felt a shift inside me, the kind of shift that only happens when a person reaches the moment where they decide they are done being pushed around. I kept recording. I let him speak freely, knowing every word was being documented. He had no idea that his own arrogance was building the evidence that would later dismantle his entire world. He leaned in one final time, lowering his voice to a cold whisper. The hallway felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped around us. My breath came out uneven, and for a second I wondered whether he could hear it. I held my ground, refusing to step back. I let him finish, watching the way his eyes held that dangerous mix of confidence and malice. He stepped back only when he felt he had delivered his message clearly enough to unsettle me. And then it happened. The line that would eventually become the turning point in everything. The line that would change my path, his career, and the future of the company. The line that the labor board would play again and again with growing disbelief. The line my attorney would later describe as career-ending. The line my former coworkers would never forget. Captured perfectly, unmistakably, clearly on audio. "You will regret it." The moment those words left his mouth, I knew the recording had become more than a precaution. It had become evidence. And evidence, once gathered, has a way of reshaping destiny. The next morning began with a silence, so strange it felt staged. I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, as I always did, expecting the usual hum of greetings from coworkers settling into their routines. Instead, the moment I walked through the door, I felt every conversation flatten. A few people glanced at me, then turned away quickly, as if eye contact had become dangerous. The air carried the heavy stillness of a place where something had been whispered behind closed doors. I sensed it before I even sat down at my desk. The office knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the recording, but the energy had shifted in a way that only happens when someone is quietly marked. I placed my bag beside my chair and opened my laptop. The familiar login screen appeared, but the moment I typed my password, a message flickered across the display. My access to the main project folder had been revoked. The same folder I had managed for 3 years. The same folder that housed every draft, report, and timeline I had created. The same folder no one else ever touched without asking me first. I stared at the notification, blinking as if it would correct itself, as if the system had made a mistake. But it remained there, cold and clear, informing me that I no longer had permission to enter the workspace I had built. I checked my email. There was a single new message, short and unsettling. It listed tasks I had never handled before, additional responsibilities that doubled my workload overnight. The deadlines were unrealistic, stacked on top of my existing projects, and nothing about the message explained why this sudden shift had happened. The sender was not my manager, not my team lead, not even someone connected to my department. It came from a generic operations address, as if no single person wanted to attach their name to my sudden burden. The message was clinical and distant. I recognized it instantly for what it was. The first layer of retaliation. I tried to stand up and speak to someone about the changes, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, people scattered like birds sensing a predator. A coworker who usually asked me about my weekend walked straight past me without acknowledging my presence. Another pretended to type vigorously when I attempted to greet her. Even the intern, who normally waved at everyone, kept her head down as she hurried toward the break room. It was as if a memo had gone out warning people to avoid me. The office did not need to shout to deliver its message. Silence did the job perfectly. I approached HR next. I had reported payroll discrepancies to them the week before, believing naively that they would address the issue professionally. Now their glass door stood half open, but when I stepped inside, the HR representative who normally greeted me with a smile kept her gaze fixed on her screen. She shuffled a stack of papers as though rearranging them would create a barrier between us. I said good morning, forcing my voice to remain steady. She responded with a quick nod that did not reach her eyes. When I asked if someone could explain the sudden changes in my workload and permissions, she glanced toward the hallway, swallowed hard, and replied with a vague comment about operational restructuring. She spoke as though reading from a script designed to say nothing at all. I waited for her to elaborate, but she simply stared at her monitor, pretending to be busy. The message was clear. HR was not going to help me. They were not going to acknowledge anything. They were performing the oldest trick in corporate retaliation, pretending nothing happened while punishing me for daring to speak up. I walked out of the office feeling an unsettling mix of anger and disbelief. Adults in professional environments often face reprimands wrapped in silence. It is the kind of punishment meant to exhaust rather than confront. A slow erosion of confidence. A quiet squeeze of pressure designed to make the target give up and leave on their own. I returned to my desk, opened the new tasks assigned to me, and felt my stomach twist. Entire sections of data were missing. The key documents I had created were now attributed to someone else. The work I had led for years was being slowly erased, one deleted file at a time. It was as if my contributions were being scrubbed from the company's memory. I clicked through folder after folder, watching access denied warnings pop up like flashing signals of exile. The more I searched, the more I realized that this was not an accident. Someone had deliberately removed me from my own work. Someone wanted me isolated. By mid-morning, the tension in the office had thickened. People whispered near the printers, but stopped talking whenever I walked by. My boss did not acknowledge me once, even though his door remained cracked open. He moved around the office with forced casualness, speaking loudly to everyone except me. I could sense him testing the environment to see if his intimidation had settled in. I kept my face neutral, but inside, a storm churned. The recording from the day before replayed itself in my mind, reminding me that I had captured undeniable proof. Yet the fear of being forced out still pressed against my ribs. The quiet punishment continued throughout the day. Every email I sent received either a delayed response or none at all. Every request for information was brushed aside with vague excuses. I watched deadlines shift without explanation. I watched meetings happen without me, even though the topics directly involved my projects. I felt the isolation tightening like a vice. This was the kind of retaliation adults over 35 know all too well. The kind where no one yells, no one writes anything down, no one says the word punishment, yet the entire environment turns its back on you. The kind meant to make you question your sanity, your value, your stability. The kind that relies on your need to provide for your family, your fear of losing your income, your desire to keep things peaceful. By lunchtime, the building felt colder. I sat alone, scrolling through documents that no longer felt like mine, trying to piece together how quickly everything had shifted. The mature part of me wanted to keep my head down, finish my tasks, and hope the storm would pass. But another part of me refused to be erased. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too many evenings, pushed through too many deadlines to be treated like a ghost. As the afternoon unfolded, new tasks kept arriving. Some were impossible. Others were irrelevant. I could sense the strategy behind them. Overwhelm me, exhaust me, push me into making mistakes, create a paper trail that could justify my removal. At one point, I received an assignment that contradicted instructions from an hour earlier. When I asked for clarification, no one responded. It was a perfect trap. A mature audience would recognize the tactic immediately. This was how companies pushed out employees without ever admitting misconduct. Later in the day, I overheard two managers discussing weekend plans. Normally, they would have acknowledged me, maybe even invited me to contribute to the conversation. Instead, they lowered their voices and shifted away, as if acknowledging me had become a liability. Their reaction cemented what I already knew.
My boss had spoken to them.
Not about the threat he made, but about me. He had likely framed me as a complainer, a disruptor, someone causing trouble. It was astonishing how quickly a reputation could be rewritten when whispered through the right hierarchy. As the workday ended, I sat at my desk long after most people had gone home. The office lights dimmed. The buzz of electronics faded. I stared at the darkened windows and felt the weight of an unspoken truth settle on my shoulders. The company had decided to pretend nothing happened because pretending protected them. Pretending meant they could quietly pressure me until I broke. Pretending meant they did not have to confront the wrongdoing festering within their walls. But I had something they did not know I had. The recording. The truth. The moment that captured the shift in power before anyone realized power had shifted at all. The office could ignore me. HR could avoid me. Coworkers could pretend I did not exist. But evidence does not care about silence. Evidence waits. Evidence grows heavier with time. Evidence has a way of cracking through every wall built to bury it. As I shut down my computer and gathered my things, one thought settled in my mind with absolute clarity. They had underestimated me. And tomorrow, the pressure they had placed on me would begin to shift in a direction they never expected. The breaking point did not arrive as an explosion. It came quietly, disguised as a routine meeting that was anything but routine. Late on a Thursday afternoon, when most of the office was already dreaming of the weekend, I received a calendar invite titled Performance Evaluation Review. The message carried no explanation. The timing made no sense. My annual review had been completed only 3 months earlier with solid ratings. Still, I walked into the glass conference room with a mix of caution and hope, trying to convince myself that maybe this was an informal check-in. Maybe the tension was temporary. Maybe the office would return to normal if I kept my head down. But the moment I entered the room, I realized I had stepped into a carefully crafted trap. My boss sat at the table with an expression that gave away nothing. An HR representative, the same one who had avoided my eyes the previous morning, sat beside him with a clipboard she never used before. A stack of papers lay in front of them. The blinds were half drawn, casting the room in uneven light. My boss gestured for me to sit. He did not greet me. He did not smile. He simply slid a document toward me and leaned back, waiting for me to read it. It was a performance improvement plan. The kind designed not to improve, but to eliminate. The language was vague, filled with phrases like failure to meet expectations and concerns regarding communication. None of it matched my actual work. None of it reflected the countless projects I had successfully completed. None of it acknowledged the overtime hours that had gone unpaid. It was a sheet of accusations crafted to create a paper trail strong enough to justify my future termination. I read the document slowly, feeling each line wrap around me like a tightening rope. My chest grew heavy. My throat tightened. Something inside me snapped. I looked up to question the false claims, but my boss interrupted with a rehearsed speech about company standards. He spoke in a tone that suggested the decision had already been made. The HR representative kept her gaze fixed on the clipboard, avoiding eye contact. I realized in that moment that the company had no intention of addressing the threat he made in the hallway. Instead, they had chosen a different path. Silence. Punishment. Erasure. I left the meeting with the document in hand. My boss told me to sign it before the end of the day. I did not respond. I walked out of the conference room feeling the weight of something deeper than corporate retaliation. This was personal. He wanted me gone, and HR was willing to help him. That evening, long after everyone had left the building, I remained seated at my desk with the improvement plan lying flat in front of me. I read it again, slower this time. The words blurred. My mind replayed the threat he whispered in the hallway. My pulse drummed in my ears. I felt a mixture of anger and fear swirling inside me. Losing my job meant losing stability. It meant losing my home, my routine, my financial security. But staying silent felt worse. Staying silent meant accepting the role of a target, accepting humiliation, accepting a future carved by someone else's hostility. As I sat there, staring at the paper, a memory drifted back to me. Years earlier, an older coworker had once told me that no matter how grown we become, some battles feel like playground confrontations dressed in adult clothing. We are taught to endure. We are taught to tolerate. We are taught to accept what we know is unfair because responsibility ties our hands. Now I understood exactly what he meant. This was that moment. A moment where endurance felt like surrender. I opened my laptop and began gathering everything I could find. Emails, timesheets,
Shalog.
meeting notes, screenshots of assignments. Every relevant detail I had saved over the last year. I organized them by date. I searched for every instance of overtime that never appeared on my paychecks. I found messages where I was asked to stay late. I found timestamps showing I had logged off long after regular hours. I found proof of every completed task, every report, every deliverable. Each document became another piece of a puzzle I never expected to build. The office grew darker as the hours passed. At some point, the automated lights switched off, leaving only the glow of my screen illuminating the desk. My fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, driven by a determination I did not know I possessed. I felt something shift in my spirit. I was no longer trying to survive. I was preparing to fight. When I finally left the office, the sun had already set. I drove home with the improvement plan beside me on the passenger seat. It felt like a threat disguised as a document. The moment I entered my apartment, I placed it on the table and stared at it, trying to quiet the noise in my mind. I made dinner, but could not eat. I turned on the television, but did not hear a single word. My thoughts kept circling around the same question. What if I lost everything by pushing back? What if speaking up cost me the job I relied on? What if no one believed me? Fear settled heavily over me, pressing down on my shoulders. The idea of losing my job terrified me. Bills,
Rent.
groceries, insurance. The weight of adulthood never felt heavier. But beneath that fear lay something far stronger.
Dignity.
Integrity, self-respect. I realized that losing my job was frightening, but losing myself was worse. I could rebuild my career. I could find another position. But I could not rebuild my sense of worth if I allowed myself to be dismantled in silence. I sat at my desk with my laptop open and typed one simple phrase into the search bar. How to file a labor complaint for unpaid overtime. That single search changed the direction of my life. Dozens of pages appeared. Government sites, legal forums, employee rights resources. I opened each one like a lifeline. I read until my eyes burned. I took notes on a yellow pad, writing down every term I did not understand. Each detail strengthened my resolve. I learned about retaliation laws. I learned about protected activities. I learned about time card violations. I learned about the rights workers have but rarely exercise out of fear. I learned that the recording I had captured was more than a precaution. It was evidence of a clear threat, a violation, a weapon the company could not silence. I stayed awake long after midnight, leaning forward over the desk, determined not to miss a single detail. My hands trembled at times, not from exhaustion but from the intensity of the moment. I felt a surge of empowerment rising beneath the fear. For the first time since the confrontation in the hallway, I felt hope. When the sun finally began to rise, a pale strip of light slipped through the blinds. I stood up, stretched my stiff muscles, and looked at the notes covering my table. Pages and pages of proof. Evidence.
Rights. Facts.
I realized that I was no longer the isolated employee trapped in a corner. I was no longer the target of silent punishment. I was someone who understood what was happening and how to respond. I picked up the improvement plan one more time and read it slowly. The anger I felt the day before had faded into something calmer and sharper.
Clarity.
Confidence. I knew I would not sign it. I knew I would not stay silent. I knew the retaliation would only intensify, but I also knew that I was prepared for it now. I had documents that could not be ignored. I had laws on my side. I had a recording that captured the truth with perfect clarity. With a deep, steady breath, I made the decision that would define everything that came afterward. I would fight back, not with shouting, not with anger, but with evidence and patience. I would protect myself. I would defend my dignity. And I would no longer let fear decide the direction of my life. Choosing myself was not a loud moment. It was quiet,
Determined.
unshakable, the kind of decision that only makes sense when everything valuable is at risk. It was the night I realized that sometimes the most powerful battles we win are the ones we decide to stop avoiding. And this was only the beginning. The morning I finally made the call felt heavier than any workday I had lived through. I woke up before my alarm, staring at the ceiling with the performance plan still burning in my mind. The silence in my apartment felt like a warning and an invitation all at once. I had gathered the documents. I had collected the emails. I had memorized the labor laws. Now the only thing left was the step I had been avoiding out of fear: calling the labor board. The thought alone made my stomach twist, but the alternative was surrender, and surrender no longer felt like an option. I sat at the small table in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, the labor board number displayed clearly on the screen. My thumb hovered over the call button. For a moment I wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe I should wait another day. Maybe the office would calm down. Maybe my boss had been bluffing. Maybe the performance plan could be negotiated. But then I remembered the threat in the hallway, the cold confidence in his voice, the refusal of HR to help me, the disappearing files. The sudden workload meant to drown me. I remembered sitting alone in the office with the lights off, gathering proof like a lifeline. None of that was exaggeration. None of it was misunderstanding. It was retaliation hiding behind silence. My hand shook as I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring tightened my chest a little more. I expected a rushed employee, a dismissive tone, a suggestion to reach out to HR instead. I expected to be treated like another complaint lost in a pile of bigger issues. But when the investigator answered, their voice was calm, steady, and attentive. They asked for my name and the nature of my concern. At first my voice came out unsteady, almost whispering. I explained the missing overtime hours. I explained the performance plan. I explained the retaliation that settled over the office like a fog. I explained the sudden isolation. The investigator listened without interrupting, taking notes in the background. Then I mentioned the threat. I told the investigator I had been confronted in a hallway. I started to describe the moment when my boss leaned close and spoke words designed to intimidate me. Before I could finish, the investigator stopped me gently and asked an unexpected question. They wanted the exact words he used. Word for word. Every syllable. My pulse quickened. My hands grew warm. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I told them I had a recording. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not confusion. Not disbelief. A pause filled with recognition. The investigator asked me to email the recording immediately. Their tone shifted from routine professionalism to sharp focus. I felt the change instantly. Suddenly what I said mattered. Suddenly my story was not just another complaint. Suddenly there was weight behind my words and urgency behind theirs. I opened my laptop with trembling fingers, attached the audio file, and clicked send. I stared at the screen afterward, hoping the file transferred clearly. A part of me feared something would malfunction. Another part wondered what would happen if the investigator found the recording too unclear. But within minutes my phone buzzed. The investigator called back. Their voice carried a different energy now, firm and decisive. They said the recording was clear. They said the words captured were serious. They said the threat was explicit enough to warrant immediate action. They asked for every document I had. Every email. Every timestamp. Every proof of unpaid hours. Every message related to the retaliation. I sent them everything in one long compressed folder. Each file felt like a step away from fear and a step toward truth. Within an hour, the investigator had already reviewed enough of the material to schedule interviews. They told me the case would be opened as a priority. They told me I was protected from retaliation under state and federal law. They told me to remain calm, to continue documenting everything, and to avoid reacting in the workplace. It was the first time in weeks that I felt the weight on my chest loosen slightly. I hung up and stared at my phone, stunned by how quickly everything had shifted. One call, one recording, one moment of courage. Suddenly the situation was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was documented. It was official. It was real. When I returned to the office, the shift in energy was immediate. My boss, who had been avoiding eye contact since the confrontation, suddenly appeared beside my desk with a forced smile. He asked how my morning was going. He complimented my latest report even though he had not read it. He offered to help with anything I needed. His tone was sugary, almost frantic. It was the kind of friendliness that appears only when someone senses danger. He hovered near my workspace, asking questions that felt more like attempts to gauge whether I had acted. Upper management behaved differently too. Executives who never acknowledged my presence suddenly greeted me in the hallway. They offered polite smiles that felt stiff and unnatural. The HR representative, who had refused to meet my gaze a day earlier, approached me with a stack of wellness resources and a brochure about workplace support programs. She pretended nothing was wrong while her eyes flickered nervously each time she glanced my way. It was the kind of performance that fools no one. I realized then that the investigator had already reached out to the company.
They had been contacted.
They knew something serious had begun. They did not know the details yet, but they knew enough to panic. Power had shifted, not loudly, but sharply. My boss could no longer treat me like a disposable employee. I was now a potential legal threat, a witness, a complainant, a liability. He walked around with restless hands, tapping his pen against his desk, pacing between cubicles, pretending to be relaxed. I knew better. He was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Throughout the day, whispers spread through the office. Managers walked faster. Doors closed more quickly. Meetings happened behind blinds. People glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Whatever the company had been told, it was enough to unsettle them, enough to make them hesitate, enough to turn their quiet punishment into awkward avoidance. No one deleted my files that day. No new tasks appeared in my inbox. No one tried to isolate me. The silence had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a shield protecting me from them. As the afternoon unfolded, emails from the labor board arrived. They requested follow-up documents. They scheduled my formal interview for the next day. They asked for names of witnesses. They asked for internal policies. Each request strengthened my case. Each message reminded me that I was no longer alone. The more documents I sent, the more confident I became. Each proof felt like another crack in the wall my boss had built around me. By the time the day ended, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Control. Not absolute control. Not victory. But control over myself.
Control over my choices.
Control over my future. Fear still lingered, but it no longer dictated my decisions. I realized that my boss was not untouchable. The company was not invincible. Their power relied on my silence. The moment I broke that silence, everything they had built against me began to shake. When I walked out of the office that evening, my boss stood by the door with a smile that looked glued onto his face. He said he appreciated my hard work.
He said he valued me.
He said he was always available if I wanted to talk. I looked at him calmly, knowing something he did not know. The recording he thought would stay buried was now in the hands of people who understood its weight. Power does not always shift with noise. Sometimes it shifts quietly, in the space of a single phone call, in the moment truth is no longer a secret. And that day, everything shifted in my favor. The investigation did not unfold slowly. It erupted. What began as a single recording tucked inside an email transformed into a force that tore through every layer of the company's structure. The day after my interview with the labor board, the investigators contacted the headquarters directly. I only learned this because the hallways changed overnight. The same managers who once strutted around with loud confidence now moved with stiff shoulders and shallow breaths. Every office door that usually remained open was suddenly closed. Every meeting had the blinds drawn. Every whispered conversation abruptly stopped when I walked by. Something enormous had been set in motion, something none of them could stop. It began with a request for department-wide payroll records. The investigators wanted everything: overtime logs, project assignments, timestamps, internal policy books, approval signatures, HR memos, emails between supervisors. The company tried to delay, hoping the investigation would lose momentum. Instead, The investigators grew even more insistent. They demanded full transparency. They wanted all communications. They wanted every missing hour accounted for. They wanted to speak not only to me, but to every employee who had worked under my boss over the last 4 years. The panic arrived next. HR moved around the building like ghosts, carrying paperwork they no longer understood. They whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting nervously from office to office. The director of HR, normally composed and icy, rushed past people without answering questions. She held her phone tightly, as if waiting for bad news to strike at any moment. Departments received sudden notices about compliance meetings. Supervisors were instructed to review past documentation. Files were pulled from archives. Everything looked chaotic, as if the company's polished reputation was beginning to crack in real time. And then the investigators found something. They discovered that the unpaid overtime did not affect only me. It spanned multiple departments. Employees had been working late nights without accurate compensation for years. Some had complained and been ignored. Others were given unofficial warnings. A few had received suspiciously timed performance write-ups that led to resignations. The patterns were unmistakable. The company had been burying violations beneath layers of intimidation and silence. When the investigators realized the scale, they broadened their inquiry. They requested to speak with former employees. The company tried to discourage contact, but by then it was too late. Word had begun to spread. Former employees who had once walked away quietly now reached out willingly. They shared stories about threats similar to the one I had recorded. They described managers who manipulated timesheets. They talked about promotions that disappeared after raising concerns. They spoke of HR meetings where they were pressured to sign documents that misrepresented their work performance. Each testimony added another brick to the wall crumbling around the company. Inside the office, the tension became suffocating. Managers who had been loud and dismissive now huddled in corners, speaking in harsh whispers. Their voices carried the edge of fear, the kind that comes from realizing the spotlight has finally turned on them. Every time the investigators requested another set of files, the panic sharpened. I watched supervisors scramble to locate documents they thought would never be examined. I saw them frantically rewrite meeting notes, trying to clean what could no longer be cleaned. I heard arguments through office walls as management tried to decide who would take responsibility and who could be sacrificed. During one of my lunch breaks, I overheard two senior managers arguing near the elevator lobby. One accused the other of deleting time sheets months earlier. The other countered that he had been following orders from higher up. Their voices cracked with frustration. It was the first time I had heard any of them sound human. Someone murmured that the investigators had already uncovered more than expected. Someone else whispered that the board was now looking into executive decisions. The building felt different in that moment.
Smaller.
Tighter. Less invincible. The investigation continued to expose patterns that shocked even me. Some departments had gone years without paying a single minute of overtime. Employees had been pressured into rewriting their time cards to align with budget restrictions. Others had been told to stay after hours but clock out early. A few supervisors had threatened employees who refused. One former worker revealed that her manager warned her to keep silent or risk professional blacklisting. Another said she was pushed into a forced resignation after questioning payroll discrepancies. Each revelation painted the same picture. A company that had spent years building an image of professionalism while burying a network of exploitation beneath it. The investigators mapped out timelines that stretched across entire divisions. They compared documents. They cross-referenced communications. The more they uncovered, the more intense the panic grew inside the building. I watched it all unfold from a distance. No one tried to intimidate me anymore. No one doubled my workload. No one deleted my access. It was as if touching me now carried too much risk. My coworkers looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and awe. Some whispered to me privately, admitting they had also experienced retaliation or unpaid overtime. Others thanked me quietly in the break room. They had been afraid to speak, but the investigation had opened a door none of them believed could ever be unlocked. At one point, a small group of long-time employees approached me near the entrance. One of them, A woman who had worked there for more than a decade said she wished she had recorded her boss years earlier. She described how she had been forced to resign after complaining about being overworked. Another man explained how he had been denied promotions after asking questions about errors on his paycheck. Their stories flowed out like water finally freed from a dam. They sounded relieved. They sounded angry. They sounded alive again, no longer silenced by fear or shame. Inside the company's upper floors, executive meetings became frantic. Leaders held emergency sessions behind closed doors. Their voices carried through the walls even when they tried to speak quietly. I heard phrases like legal exposure and systemic misconduct and regulatory consequences. The company had built a fortress of silence for years, but the investigation had cracked the foundation so violently that the entire structure was tilting. The investigators visited the building more frequently. Their arrival always caused a ripple of tension. Managers straightened their posture. HR stiffened. Supervisors avoided eye contact. The investigators moved with calm purpose, every question they asked slicing through another layer of the company's defenses. They requested interview after interview. They reviewed files with methodical precision. They uncovered email chains that contradicted management's claims. They unearthed records of former employees who had been pushed out. They found discrepancies in bonus approvals, performance evaluations, and disciplinary actions. It was astounding to see how one recording, one moment in a hallway, had opened the door to an entire network of wrongdoing. The company had never expected anyone to challenge them. They relied on fear. They relied on silence. They relied on the belief that employees needed the paycheck more than they needed justice. But once the labor board stepped in, silence was no longer protection. Evidence spoke louder than the company's well-rehearsed narratives. The atmosphere became so tense that even the executives who once moved with arrogance began to avoid the hallways. One morning I arrived to find the vice president of operations pacing outside the conference room with a look of genuine anxiety. His tie was crooked, his hair uncombed. He looked like a man wrestling with the reality that the empire he helped build was collapsing. Two other executives spoke in hushed tones about compliance reviews. Another clutched a stack of papers like a lifeline. Even HR, the department that had initially brushed me aside, began to show cracks. The HR representative who once avoided my gaze now looked at me with fear in her eyes. She knew her role in the retaliation. She knew she had dismissed my concerns. She knew she had supported the very system now being exposed. In meetings, her voice trembled. She shuffled papers nervously. Every question from the investigators seemed to unravel another part of her confidence. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded further. Former supervisors were asked to return for interviews. Old emails were subpoenaed. Documents that had been buried in storage rooms were pulled out and reviewed. The investigators mapped a timeline of misconduct that stretched back years. They found inconsistencies in training budgets. They uncovered proof of manipulated employee evaluations. They discovered that forced resignations had been disguised as voluntary departures. The company's fortress crumbled piece by piece. The weight of truth pressed down on the entire system, revealing that the retaliation against me was only one thread in a much larger web of exploitation. Every time I walked through the building, I could feel the anxiety rising from every corner. People whispered.
People panicked.
People realized the truth was no longer buried. My single complaint had cracked open a wall. And behind that wall lay an entire history of deception the company could no longer hide. The day the settlement was announced did not begin with celebration. It began with a tension so thick it felt like a storm gathering inside a quiet room. I arrived early that morning, long before the company sent out the internal memo summoning employees to the boardroom. The sky outside was gray. The air carried the heavy stillness of a moment balanced on the edge of change. I sat at my desk trying to focus on work, but every email notification made my pulse jump. I already knew the labor board decision was coming soon. I just did not know it would arrive that day. At exactly 10:15, my screen flickered with a new message marked high priority. It was from corporate legal. The subject line was short and cold. Mandatory attendance for all employees. Boardroom A, 10:30. No exceptions. The wording alone made half the office stand up at once. Chairs shifted.
Phones were placed face down.
People who had ignored me for weeks walked past my desk without meeting my eyes, but their stiff shoulders gave away their unease. They sensed the end of something. They sensed consequences approaching. They sensed that the walls they had helped maintain were finally collapsing. The boardroom was already packed when I stepped inside. Executives lined one side of the long table. Department heads filled the other. HR sat in a cluster near the back, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. The rest of us stood against the walls or gathered near the entrance. The air felt hot and restless. People whispered quietly to each other, trying to guess why the announcement required legal presence. My boss stood near the window, arms folded, jaw tight, eyes locked on the floor. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. At the front of the room stood two labor board officials. Their posture was composed, their expressions unreadable. One of them held a thick binder filled with documents. The sound of the boardroom door closing behind the last employee silenced the room entirely. The lead investigator stepped forward and began to speak in a calm, authoritative voice that carried through the tension like a blade. They announced that the labor board had completed its investigation. They stated that the company had violated multiple labor laws, including unpaid overtime, documented retaliation, forced resignations under pressure, and manipulation of performance evaluations. They explained that the investigation had uncovered a pattern of systemic misconduct stretching across several departments. Every word tightened the air in the room. Some employees lowered their heads. Others stared straight ahead, as if frozen in place. Then the investigator opened the binder and read the official ruling. The labor board had ordered the company to pay a total settlement of $435,000 to affected employees. Compensation would be distributed based on documented overtime, lost wages, emotional distress, and retaliatory harm. They detailed the breakdown, department by department, employee by employee. My name appeared first, not because I had suffered the most hours of unpaid work, but because the case began with my evidence. The recording I captured that day in the hallway had become the cornerstone of the investigation. It was listed in the ruling as a pivotal piece of proof. Hearing my name spoken in that packed room sent a cold rush through me. My knees felt both weak and rooted in the floor. The investigator explained that, without the recording, the scope of misconduct might have remained hidden for years. Silence filled the room again. This time it felt different.
Heavy.
Respectful. Uneasy.
People turned their heads toward me.
Some looked at me with a strained gratitude. Others looked at me with fear, as if I possessed a kind of power they had never noticed before. A few stared with guilt, remembering how they had ignored me when the retaliation began. Even HR shifted uncomfortably, their faces tight with embarrassment. My boss finally looked up. His eyes met mine for the briefest second.
It was not anger I saw.
It was something far more honest.
Defeat.
Real, undeniable defeat. His shoulders slumped. His breathing seemed shallow. The investigator continued speaking, explaining the legal obligations the company now faced, but my boss's expression said everything long before the official reprimand reached him. The Human Resources Director was named next. The board stated that HR had failed to uphold impartial protocol. They had dismissed valid concerns. They had supported retaliatory actions. They had violated the standards expected of their role. Several managers were mentioned as well, each tied to a specific pattern of misconduct revealed during the investigation. The room felt like it was shrinking. The scent of fear clung to the air. When the investigator finished reading the ruling, they paused and explained that follow-up compliance checks would be conducted over the next 6 months. They advised employees to report any further retaliation directly to them. Their eyes swept the room with a warning that no one missed. The message was clear. The era of silence had ended. Once the officials closed their binder, they stepped back, giving the company executives their turn to speak. The CEO looked pale. His attempt at a composed expression failed the moment he opened his mouth. His voice cracked as he apologized for the systemic failures. He claimed the company was committed to rebuilding trust. His words felt rehearsed and fragile. He avoided looking at me entirely. The department heads nodded mechanically, but their eyes carried a different truth. They were rattled. They were exposed. Their power no longer felt secure. When the announcement concluded, the room remained still. No one rushed to leave. No one spoke. People seemed stunned by the magnitude of the settlement. $435,000. Not a rumor. Not speculation. A measurable, undeniable consequence. One that would follow the company for years. Slowly, employees began to file out. Some approached me hesitantly. A few offered quiet thank yous. One whispered that they felt relief for the first time in years. Another said the investigation had validated everything they had quietly endured. The gratitude in their eyes felt real. It felt earned. It felt heavy. My boss remained near the window, alone. He looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. When I finally walked past him, he opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The man who had threatened me in a hallway now looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. The investigator's ruling had stripped away the shield he believed power had given him. He realized that a single recording had undone everything. He realized that intimidation had cost him control. When I stepped out of the boardroom, executives stopped talking as I passed. They watched me with a tense recognition given to someone who held truth strong enough to change the course of an entire company. It was not admiration. It was not fear alone. It was the awareness that their authority had limits, and that I had proven it. Back at my desk, I sat down slowly, letting the moment sink in. I thought about the long nights gathering proof. I thought about the quiet panic that had filled the office weeks earlier. I thought about the fear that once kept me silent. And then I looked at the settlement announcement sitting in my inbox with my name printed at the top. The power shift was no longer invisible. It was printed clearly, documented, undeniable. The same people who once dismissed me had watched the truth unfold in front of them. The same managers who acted like gatekeepers now stood exposed. The same HR staff who ignored my concerns now stared at the consequences of their inaction. This was the moment everything had been building toward. High tension. High consequence. High reward. The truth had been spoken in a room where lies once moved freely. And the room would never be the same again. The downfall did not happen with a dramatic explosion. It happened with quiet steps that echoed through the hallway like a slow unraveling of everything my boss once believed made him untouchable. It began 3 days after the settlement announcement. By then, the building had developed a strange atmosphere, a blend of tension, shame, and muted relief. People whispered in the break room. Managers avoided eye contact with employees. HR walked around with stiff smiles that crumbled the moment anyone turned away. Everyone sensed that consequences were coming, and they sensed exactly where they would land. Early that morning, long before the sun fully rose, a company-wide memo appeared in every inbox. Mandatory leadership restructuring effective immediately. That was the subject line. The message was short and vague. It stated that several managerial positions were being reviewed based on the findings of the investigation. It listed no names, but everyone knew who stood at the center of that list. I walked into the office with the memo still glowing on my screen and found the building unusually quiet. The usual laughter from the marketing department was absent. The customer service phones rang, but fewer people answered. Supervisors kept their doors closed, and the operations team looked unsettled as they gathered papers with shaking hands. Then it happened. A member of corporate security stepped out of the elevator. He carried a neutral expression, the kind that revealed nothing and promised everything. He walked down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, heading straight for my boss's office. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A few people leaned out of their cubicles. The air froze around us as the security guard opened the door without knocking. My boss stood behind his desk, his tie loosened, his face pale. He attempted to mask his reaction with an expression of confusion, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew exactly why the guard had arrived. The guard spoke to him quietly. My boss's shoulders dropped. Whatever he heard made him glance toward the hallway with a look that hovered between disbelief and dread. He opened a drawer, closed it, then opened another. The guard placed a firm hand on the edge of the desk as if reminding him to take only personal items. For the first time, The man who once controlled the entire floor looked like he had lost the power to form a clear thought. He reached for a cardboard box and began placing items inside slowly. The office watched in a stunned silence that felt nearly cinematic. He packed a stack of files, a framed certificate, a few pens, and the photo of his dog he always displayed to appear approachable. His movements were numb, shaky, almost disconnected from the confident man who once strutted through the halls issuing commands. I remained at my desk, watching from a distance as he continued loading his belongings under the guard's supervision. He avoided looking in my direction, but I could feel the tension spreading across the room. Some employees peeked over their monitors. Others stood silently near the copy machine pretending to do tasks they no longer cared about. When he finally lifted the box in his hands, the guard gestured toward the door. My boss hesitated for a brief moment, his gaze dropping to the floor as though he expected a last-minute reprieve. None came. He stepped into the hallway, with the box held tightly against his chest. The same hallway where he once cornered me with a threat meant to intimidate now served as the pathway of his removal. Every footstep he took echoed with poetic justice. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the scene, illuminating how starkly his power had evaporated. As he passed by employees, the shift in energy was unmistakable. Some stepped aside without offering even a nod. Others stared with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. A few crossed their arms, remembering their own experiences of mistreatment. No one stopped him. No one defended him. No one asked him to stay. The hallway had witnessed his cruelty. Now it bore witness to his fall. When he reached my desk, he kept his eyes forward, but the tension between us was as sharp as a blade. He did not speak. He did not glance in my direction. He simply walked past, as though the weight of what he had done finally pressed against him in a way he could no longer deny. For a moment, I caught the slightest tremor in his hand as he shifted the box. It was the closest thing to remorse I ever saw from him. The guard escorted him all the way to the elevator. The doors slid open with a mechanical hum. My boss stepped inside. The guard pressed the lobby button. As the doors began to close, my boss finally looked up. His eyes swept across the floor one last time, landing briefly on the space where I sat. There was no anger, no arrogance, only the hollow recognition that he had been undone not by gossip or speculation but by his own words, captured clearly on the recording he never imagined would leave that hallway. The door shut, sealing the moment in finality. As soon as he was gone, the office exhaled. It was not relief alone. It was the release of years of pent-up tension. Employees looked at each other with wide eyes, processing what they had just witnessed. A few shook their heads. Some whispered that they never thought this day would come. Others returned to their desks slowly, moving with a stunned heaviness. The next memo arrived an hour later. Effective immediately, he was removed from all managerial roles and permanently ineligible for future leadership within the company. The memo also stated that he would not be rehired, recommended, or endorsed for future positions within the industry. In simple terms, he was blacklisted. His career, once built on control and intimidation, had been stripped away in a single sweep. HR leadership suffered consequences as well. The director resigned that same afternoon. 2 representatives were reassigned to non-managerial roles. Their absence left a visible gap in the department, one that reflected the magnitude of their involvement in the retaliation. No one celebrated their departure, but no one mourned it either. It felt like a necessary correction. Several managers resigned in embarrassment during the week that followed. Some claimed personal reasons. Others cited stress or shifting priorities. But everyone knew the truth. They had participated in a system that collapsed under its own corruption. They had ignored complaints. They had contributed to the culture of silence. And now they were stepping aside before the spotlight turned toward them. The atmosphere in the company changed in subtle and noticeable ways. Employees carried themselves differently. They spoke more openly. They asked questions without fear. They reported concerns directly instead of burying them. The culture of intimidation that once dominated the office began to dissolve. In meetings, voices that had been silenced for years finally found confidence again. And every time I walked through the hallway where the threat had been whispered, I felt the weight of what had been reclaimed. That narrow space had once been the symbol of my vulnerability. Now it was the hallway where justice had arrived. My boss's exit had rewritten the story of that corner forever. One of the newer employees approached me near the break room that afternoon. She said she admired my courage. Another worker thanked me quietly for standing up when others could not. I did not respond with pride or triumph. I responded with simple honesty. I told them I did not feel brave. I told them I had acted because I reached a point where silence felt like surrender. They nodded as if understanding a deeper truth, the truth that sometimes the most powerful disruption begins with a moment of fear transformed into action. The downfall of my boss was not just the end of his reign. It was the end of a culture built on intimidation. It was a signal to every employee who had been mistreated. It was a reminder that power is not invincible. It is borrowed. It is fragile. And when misused, it collapses faster than anyone expects. The day he was escorted out, the company learned a lesson it could never unlearn. And I stepped into my own strength without looking back. The months that followed felt like stepping out of a long storm and realizing the sky had been blue all along. For the first time in years, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night, replaying conversations in my head. My breathing felt different. My mornings felt lighter. The tension that once clung to my shoulders slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet strength I had forgotten I possessed. I did not rush to find a new job after everything ended. I gave myself space to breathe, to heal, to understand what had happened. There was no victory parade, no desire to brag about what the investigation uncovered. I simply wanted my peace back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I was allowed to claim it. Eventually, an offer came from a company I had admired from a distance for years. The position aligned perfectly with my experience. During the interview, they asked me why I left my previous job. I answered with maturity, mentioning changes in leadership and workplace culture. I did not speak about the settlement or the recording or the chaos that had unfolded. I did not need to. I felt no urge to expose anyone, no temptation to glorify what had happened. My past would remain part of my story, but not the definition of my future. The manager nodded as if appreciating a level of restraint not often seen in people who had endured so much. A few days later, they welcomed me into their team. The new office felt like a different world. The culture was respectful. Communication was transparent. Employees spoke openly in meetings without fear of being punished for honesty. For the first time, I understood how much damage my previous environment had caused. I had normalized anxiety. I had accepted distrust as part of the job. I had become accustomed to hostility, disguised as management. Now, sitting in a workspace where my voice was valued, I realized how deeply the old place had chipped away at my confidence. My new coworkers treated me with kindness, not out of obligation but out of habit. The contrast was powerful enough to feel physical. Slowly, the pieces of my life began to fall back into place. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. I stopped replaying old conversations. I stopped walking through every room expecting conflict. My evenings no longer felt like recovery time from a battle. I cooked dinner without exhaustion weighing down my hands. I read books again. I reconnected with hobbies I had put aside because stress had eaten up every corner of my mind. My world expanded in small ways that made me appreciate life beyond work. One evening I walked past my reflection in a shop window and saw something unexpected.
Calm.
Not forced calm. Not the type worn like armor.
Real calm.
A steadiness that came from surviving something heavy and rising on the other side without losing myself. I realized that the entire experience had taught me something that adulthood often hides beneath bills, responsibilities, and long work hours. Dignity matters. It matters more than a paycheck, more than a title, more than staying quiet to keep the peace. When you're young, you think losing a job is the worst thing that can happen. When you're older, you understand that losing yourself is worse. From time to time, someone from my old company reached out quietly. One former coworker sent a message thanking me again for standing up when no one else could. Another told me that the office atmosphere had transformed completely since leadership changed. They said employees finally felt safe again. They said people were no longer afraid to speak up. Their messages meant more to me than any legal victory ever could. Knowing that the truth had created lasting change felt like the real accomplishment. I heard through the grapevine that my former boss struggled to find work after the investigation. His name carried a shadow that followed every application he submitted. He had been removed quietly from professional circles. No one wanted to take a risk on a leader whose actions had dismantled an entire department. I did not feel triumph hearing this. I felt clarity. Actions have consequences, even for those who believe they are too powerful to face them. There were moments when people asked me how I managed to stay composed during everything. I always gave the same answer. I did not stay composed. I simply chose not to lose myself. The fear had been real. The stress had been overwhelming. The uncertainty had been heavy enough to bend my spirit at times. But something rooted deeper kept me from collapsing. It was the understanding that dignity cannot be restored once surrendered. And I was not willing to give mine away. Adults over 35 understand this lesson more than anyone. Life teaches you that protecting your sanity is not weakness. It is wisdom. Silence may keep you safe for a while, but truth is the only thing that protects you in the long run. The most dangerous people in any workplace are the ones who believe they are untouchable. They hide behind titles. They hide behind policies. They hide behind fear. But fear dissolves the moment evidence appears, and that is something many powerful people never expect. My recording was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of self-preservation. It captured the moment my boss revealed who he really was. It documented the shift from workplace tension to outright abuse of power. It became the catalyst for everything that followed. I never bragged about it. I never flaunted it. I simply gave it to the right people at the right time. The rest unfolded naturally. Months later, as I sat at my new desk looking out the window of my new office, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. Not the kind you chase in anger. The kind that finds you when you least expect it. The kind that arrives with quiet acceptance. I realized then that revenge had never been the goal. Justice had never been about watching someone fall. It had been about standing tall again after being pushed down repeatedly. It had been about reclaiming my voice, my peace, and my sense of worth. The lesson for anyone over 35 is simple and grounded in truth. Powerful people think they are untouchable until someone collects the truth one recording at a time. And in the end, protecting your dignity is worth more than any job title, any paycheck, or any temporary illusion of security. Because jobs come and go. Titles rise and fade. But dignity stays with you for the rest of your life.